So hello, everyone. This is Rachel from MENA S&R, and I'm really excited to be with you all today, sharing this conversation. Today, I'm speaking with Alper Yalc. I am so self-conscious of my presentation, so Alper will re-say his last name to make sure that I got it in the vicinity. Alper is an assistant professor of sociology at TED University in Ankara, Turkey, and before that he was at Ohio Wesleyan University in the US. So we get to hear a little bit about Alper's research today, perspectives he has on this field, if you can call it a field of science and religion, this conversation, this interdisciplinary kind of place. And I know, Alper, you yourself are a professor of sociology, but you've also very much taken a historical perspective. So I'm glad to begin anywhere you would like to, in terms of either talk about your research trajectory, what you started looking at, what you're looking at now, how you got drawn to the field, and then, of course, any advice you might have for people who are looking at this field. And we could get into some more fine-grained questions along the way as well. But really looking forward to hearing your insights on all of this.
Thanks, Rachel, and also, thanks for inviting me. I'm really excited to be a part of this network and also to participate in this conversation with you as well. Yeah, let me say a few things about, how I ended up here. Like you said, I studied history for a while, actually. That's how I started my graduate education in Turkey. I was at a history program. But of course, originally my BA is in sociology. So I always thought of myself as someone between those two fields. At University of California, San Diego, I studied sociology and science studies, where my advisor was John Evans, of course, a major scholar in the field of sociology of science and religion. At the beginning, and kind of currently, my interest is primarily, or has been and is primarily, what we might call maybe the culture of science in this region, and in Turkey in particular. Like I said, my research was historical at the beginning, and it still kind of is. So I was interested in primarily the 19th century context in which the Ottoman Empire, or intellectuals in the Ottoman Empire, debated what these modern sciences were, their merits, their perhaps potential, dangers. And where science could be located in the institutional context of the Ottoman Empire, but also in culture. What did the modern sciences kind of mean in terms of also both kind of as a practice and also as a way of knowing? And if the older terms that existed in the language could be applied to the new sciences, etc., those types of stuff were what I was interested in. And when I did my research on the 19th century debate in the Ottoman Empire on science, what I found very consistently in the Ottoman newspapers or in the texts of that period was a debate not necessarily on science, or not exclusively on science, but maybe primarily on what you might call the man of science. I'm going to use the gendered term because that's the reality of the time. What kind of a person is a man of science? What kind of a person is a person who knows about and maybe practices the new sciences? Is this a person that we can trust? Is this a person with a certain type of character? Is this a person who is perhaps to some degree dangerous? A debate on what scientists were like, or what scientists should be like. What kind of a citizen is a man of science? And when I was reading those Ottoman newspapers and texts, I also found obviously that the debate is also about defining the boundaries of science, and again, a major topic in the sociology of science as well. What can be classified as science, what is outside of that sphere. And when you look at those boundary debates, obviously, one of the first things that you will encounter is religion. And I was not necessarily studying the field primarily with an emphasis on religion, but of course that is something that you're going to sooner or later come across. And in the Ottoman case, obviously, there's lots and lots of debate on science and Islam. Not only in terms of, questions of like, trust, credibility, belief, etc., but also in terms of the causes of the so-called, Ottoman decline. When I was reading the newspapers of the 1870s, 1880s and onwards, I saw, and many people are familiar with these things anyway, like lots of articles written to kind of, so to speak, like defend Islam, right? Islam is not the cause of decline. Islam is not the reason why we are militarily or economically, behind Europe now. It is due to other reasons. Islam should be defended against these types of criticism that was coming from both inside the Ottoman Empire, obviously, but also European writers, Orientalists, politicians from Europe, or journalists, etc., that the Ottoman intellectuals were reading, were very commonly talking about Islam as a backward religion, again, something that prevents rational thought, etc., etc. So gradually, and of course, because I was studying with John Evans too, I started to find it more and more interesting to think of how science and religion were kind of, defined or described in relation to one another in the Ottoman case. So when you are defending Islam, again, like defending always in, scare quotes, when you're defending Islam, how do you define it such that it is in harmony with science? And again, when you're saying that Islam and science are in harmony, how are you defining science such that there is harmony? And one of my first publication was about this type of text, in which an Ottoman intellectual was using the writings of John William Draper, again, a major character in the science and religion field, using Draper's arguments to kind of make a case for Islam, to argue that it is Christianity that is in conflict with science, not Islam. And of course, in the history of science and religion, Draper's, conflict between science and religion is like a major book. So when I published that article, I guess that is how I found myself gradually entering this network. I met Ron Numbers, and then Bernie Lightman, and then later, of course, Peter Harrison, etc. So with the kind of inspiration from these scholars, I looked more and more carefully at this kind of the travel, like the way in which the science and religion debate traveled, from one context to another. And that is still kind of like what I'm looking at. My more recent work has been on thinking about the science and religion debate as kind of like a global debate, and the Ottoman case as simply a case within it, not to study it as a unique, very interesting, it is interesting, obviously, but it's not very like necessarily unique. It's not very, very, very starkly different from everything else. So it's kind of like a global debate about science and religion in the late 19th, early 20th centuries, to which the Ottoman intellectuals were themselves also contributing. And that is kind of, what I'm trying to study more in depth, like how ideas from one context travel to another, and how they acquire kind of like new meanings there. Maybe like something written in India about Islam travels to Istanbul. In Istanbul, it is, it changes perhaps its function. In the meantime, those ideas are mixed with maybe like writings from like ideas from like the French context. Something new emerges, and then those ideas maybe then go to I don't know, Egypt, right? And then, maybe from there, like to the United States. These types of, the ways in which ideas travel within the context of the science and religion debate is kind of like what I'm interested in these days. And ultimately, like, let me just like stop talking for a minute. But I think like the interesting thing to me right now is how science and religion as categories start to, or the degree to which they start to resemble one another in different cultural contexts, like how science and religion are defined in different contexts and the degree to which these definitions come to resemble each other, like maybe some kind of homogenization in terms of like a global culture, the turning of different traditions into, again, in scare quotes, religions. So like maybe like how Islam, say different branches of Christianity, Buddhism, Hinduism become these phenomena that can be compared to one another, that can be classified all in the same category. What kind of a process was it that that gave us this notion of world religions, etc. So that is what I'm gonna be looking at for a while at this point.
Wow. Well, there's so much there that I would like to follow up on, but I guess maybe just in terms of your last point, if you could maybe just flesh it out for me a little bit more. Like, is there a particular period where you see a transition from sort of these parallel conversations that are happening more in isolation to this global conversation? Because obviously, sometimes when the term globalization is used, that's used in a later period, and it sounds to me like you're using it in an earlier period. So I just to understand more if there was a transition when this occurred to the global conversation. And so on the one hand, from what I understood, you're saying then chronology is really important because you have different historical periods in this global conversation, but you're saying culture is still also important because there are certain different versions of the global conversation happening in different cultural contexts, with some homogenization between the variations in terms of coming to consensus about what a religion would be or science would be, where there was much more variety in earlier periods between cultures, and then that sort of like flattens out to a certain degree, or maybe sometimes seems to flatten out, but there's actually more variety hidden underneath some of these terms, which people then might have different assumptions coming to the global conversation or things like that. So anyway, for me, it raised a lot of different questions, both historical and sociological and whatnot. So I was just wondering if you could flesh that out a little bit more. And then, because it seems like what you were saying is this sort of or like a new trend in the field that we should all sort of be thinking about maybe a little bit differently than we had before. So
yeah, I guess that is something. Yeah, let me start with that last point you made. I think that is something that is worth looking more carefully at. This again, like thinking of this in terms of exactly as you said, to a certain degree, homogenization or standardization, but yeah, beneath what is visible, what kinds of diversity, what kinds of variation we can still find. Like again, before answering your question, I mean, there's something really basic, right? In the maybe 1880s, it wouldn't have been very difficult. It wouldn't have been very easy for you if you wanted to, like, say, organize a conference on, say, like biology, to invite people from, like, say 120 countries of the world. It wouldn't be that easy. But today, of course, every country will be able to send you a person that they will call a biologist or a scientist. In the 1880s, in the 1890s, maybe that concept or that kind of identity did not really exist in many parts of the world. So I'm really interested in, like, now every country will be able to tell you every society has its scientists today. Like countries like join organizations like UNESCO. These are kind of like ways of kind of in a way joining the so-called global community or whatever. So we are living in a world in which there is more standardization, but yeah, like for my research or for my interest, the peculiar or the interesting period is the 1880s, 1890s. That's when you start to see, of course, it had started earlier, but like the emergence of fields like comparative religion, to some degree also the discipline of Orientalism itself. In the 1890s, you also have the World Congress of Religions, in the United States. There's debate on maybe even like creating potentially like a one religion for the age of science, right? And many different people contribute to this debate, talking about the merits of their own religions. But when they join that conversation again, they also start to, or maybe consciously or unconsciously, they also start to define their own tradition as, again, like a religion. So I would say the critical period is probably the late 19th century. And again, like the writings of Draper. So, why do you translate Draper into Turkish? It was published in the 1870s. It's translated into Turkish in the 1890s. So once again, that is a period in which the thing that I'm talking about, in terms of the standardization really starts to take place, I would say. But again, I looked at that period primarily, but I am also interested I also studied the 1950s in the Turkish case. I also recently studied the contemporary case in Turkey. This was more like a sociological work, and that is something that I also want to continue doing. Maybe now it is more likely to see the diversity or the variation that the earlier projects or the earlier studies did not necessarily pay enough attention to. Everybody's talking about science and religion, but what exactly are they talking about when they use those terms? Now that we've kind of like covered a lot of ground, I think it's now time to look at the more, nuanced, more like kind of more subtle points about these things. What exactly do people mean when they use the word science or religion? On that point, actually, like maybe I could say a few things about my more recent sociological study, which I will also connect to. You were saying something about like the changes in the field, or maybe like
Yeah,
ideas
maybe
about.
just to wrap up the one thing about the earlier period, I was just,
Sure.
sort of, I guess, from like a history of technology perspective or something, like what you spoke about, that was the period when discussions of world religions began and things along those lines. But were there other triggers that, in the publication field or other things like that I'm sure a lot of things created that moment of globalization, just like, in later periods, there was the internet or other things. So I was just sort of curious about just like maybe a few more, for those of us who don't study that period, if there's just like a few more hints of explaining that moment. And then I would love to transition to the current period. And then that also might let those of us who are less familiar see a bit of like, historical change and things along those lines.
Sure, you're right. I obviously I forgot about many of the things that I was gonna say. Like publication, obviously in the same period, like we do see like a publication boom in many parts of the world, newspapers, etc. Like also, these are major ways in which ideas travel. But another thing that I wanted to add is, of course, like missionaries. Missionaries, again, had been in different parts of the world for quite a while, but in the 19th century, missionary work also involves a lot of publication about science and religion. And especially like, in the Middle Eastern case, we see lots of, Protestant missionaries in this region starting to talk about the harmony between Christianity and science, and of course, like writing also about maybe not that much or maybe very carefully about potential conflicts between Islam and science. And in the Ottoman case, we do see Muslim authors responding to actual missionary publications or imagined ideas of the missionaries. So that is really another thing that I wanted to talk about. That is something that I did research on, and I want to do more of that. In the case of, for example, like Africa too, there's that debate on what will be the future of religion in Africa. This is, of course, the age of colonialism, etc. So is Islam or is Christianity gonna win, so to speak, Africa? Right. And in those types of debate, you do see also things like, well, the African mind is maybe not ready for something sophisticated like, Christianity. Maybe Islam will win there because it's more simple. It will kind of like, eliminate those so-called, primitive ideas. And then after that, Christianity can go into that region, be more
transitional form.
Exactly. And, when it happens, like Christianity will also make them again so-called more rational, whatever, and then science will also flourish in those places as well. So it's really an interesting idea to think that religions are also, you know, some of them are more primitive, some of them are more sophisticated, obviously, and like, you know, where is Islam, where is Christianity, you know, in that kind of, you know, spectrum. And again, like, placing religions in that kind of spectrum also is in that period linked to the extent to which they are in harmony with science. So it is really interesting, that kind of, you know, comparative or yeah, like comparative and competitive kind of way of thinking about, you know, religions, and how science, harmony with science, becomes a criterion in, you know, making these types of judgment. So yeah, colonialism and missionary work, and again, like the publication boom, are all interconnected. And of course, like, you know, other things like, say, you know, the trains or telegraph. So all of those, you know, like facilitate the, you know, travel of ideas. And again, of course, like people also do travel much more often than before, you know, in this period. So yeah, you do see people, not just ideas, but obviously like people themselves, you know, traveling from one place to another, like coming from India through maybe Arabia to Istanbul, and then, you know, finding themselves in different parts of Europe as well. And again, in each of those stories, maybe we could actually like do more work on individual stories like this, you know, different types of people traveling from one place to another and finding themselves in different types of debate, some of which are about science and religion.
Thank you very much. Okay, now you are free to proceed to the contemporary period or any other stops along the way in the mid-20th century or whatever you'd like to transition to.
Yeah, I don't have to talk too much about any of those, but like, yeah, another interesting time period is obviously the Cold War. If you look at the 20th century, um, thinking about things like, you know, what type of political system is most conducive to scientific research. And of course, in that time period, when the US was representing itself as, again, like the leader of the free world, it was not simply about, you know, things like democracy or whatever, but also creating a more free academic or, you know, scientific world, defining it as the, you know, like a leader of intellectual and scientific growth. But at the same time, it also presented itself as a place in which religion was also practiced and, you know, like freely. So in the Turkish case, you know, of course, there's like a big political transformation there. But for especially more conservative Turkish intellectuals, the US appeared as the model that shows that a country can be both scientifically very advanced and also religious. So there's a lot of, you know, anti-communism in that time period. Also related to this claim that, yeah, like, you know, yeah, maybe the Soviet world, the Eastern Bloc, you know, was advanced in science, but they did it by also fighting religion. So it's not a great model. The US model is the best model because, yeah, they are very religious. Their scientists themselves are also religious, etc. So that is another thing that I did some research on, but I want to focus more on like the image of the United States as the place in which, you know, science and religion coexist harmoniously, the way the US represented itself, US intellectuals represented the country that way, and also the way it was perceived in a place like Turkey as a great model. And of course, like the US is always like an interesting case in the sociology and history of religion as well.
Right. And I think some of those church and state issues were also in transition in the US in those periods. So, for example, like now, if you were looking at, for example, I just finished a project on evolution education. So in England, if students have a religious question about evolution, that could be discussed in a classroom, whereas in the US, that would be a violation of the separation of church and state. So there's always these reshufflings of different cultural images, but it's really poignant to be brought back to this home of the free and the brave, where the pursuit of religion and science, again, it also brings us back to your idea perhaps of the personality and the character and people you can trust, because it has all three of these points on the triangle of the, you know, the democracy and the religion and the science. It's, I think, really interesting to see those different configurations there. So I agree with you that sounds like.
Yeah. And I haven't done research on that, but yeah, like everybody is familiar with this, like, you know, the influence of US, creationism on different creationisms around the world, like how not only, again, like not only ideas, but also other types of resource, like traveled like from the US to different parts of the world, to like support creationist movements. It's quite interesting in that way as well.
And then that's a new version of a religion that's taking things in a different direction.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah, and of course, yeah, like there's also that too, right? Maybe that is something that we could also do more work on. I mean, that has been a claim made quite often anyway, but like, how Protestantism or a certain understanding of Protestantism becomes in a way the model that we maybe sometimes unconsciously use, even in all studies about religion. Because again, the field has been so much dominated by, scholars from the United States. And again, like in all fields, there is the influence of the American, influence of American scholarship on our field. So probably one of the things that we could do more on is like, to kind of, in a way, like, change the, or like challenge the narrative. Like what exactly are, the ways in which people understand religion in different parts of the world. Maybe again, like the Protestant approach puts maybe too much emphasis on, the belief aspect, not as much on the practical aspect. So people's attitudes towards science and religion, we ask questions about, what they believe or what they see. But again, like we don't do as much work on like, if that has any influence on the way people live, or whether people even care about these things. Again, because there has been that debate in the United States, evolution has been such a controversial topic, etc. We just assume that those are things that also matter to other people, or like we don't exactly have maybe great ways of studying whether things matter to people, or like whether even if they matter to people, like what do they do about it in practice. I think that is something quite important. So that actually like is a segue to my like more contemporary research. I interviewed this is part of a major project that Elaine Eklund and like John Evans, Rice, and UCSD kind of organized about the sociology of science and religion. And my own research in this big project was about Turkish college students, women, female college students' views on science and religion. And when I
Yay, we
interviewed,
got to women.
yeah, exactly. So here is something important, right? Gender is not something that we've studied much. And of course, that was a really interesting thing for me because what I found, not surprisingly perhaps, but still I didn't expect to see it being like so salient. So when you talk to the people that I interviewed about science and religion, it is one thing. But when you introduce the gender dimension, it turns into a very different kind of conversation. So I asked questions about, for example, on issues of gender and sexuality, is science or religion the kind of guide, if you will? Of course, like no, the conversation was more like complex than that, but very generally that was the main theme. And it was again surprising for me to see like that science is much more powerful in the eyes of these female college students as something that can tell us that can give us reliable information on gender and sexuality. But of course, like in those conversations, what I saw was also something that we know, but maybe we should pay more attention to how much the context matters, the political context. Every time like I had these conversations with my interviewees, they wanted to talk about the contemporary political scene in Turkey. So every topic from say evolution, Big Bang, or whatever would somehow be connected to the kind of like the political problems of our time. So again, maybe that is also an important message, right? Like people's ideas don't exist in this kind of like no vacuum. Like no, they are usually related to something that they care more deeply about. Like even things that you wouldn't necessarily see connected to one another might be connected because of the fact that they're related to something bigger in the minds of these people. So again, many of my interviewees said, science and Islam can be in harmony, but there's a gender problem, especially in religion. And on that issue, maybe like there will never be harmony. And even some of my religious, interviews made that argument. And some of them even said, stop doing research on science and religion, do research on gender and religion. They wanted to link everything to that issue. And like, I'm kind of like now trying to, finish that article. But it was quite interesting for me to see that. Like on issues of gender and sexuality, I have nothing to talk to, religious scholar about, was a response that I heard very often. And again, I would say this is not necessarily a, like conviction that they would always have, but it's related to the political context, to contemporary of contemporary Turkey.
Because religious establishment is seen as following the conservative political regime, and they don't feel like there's religious avenues that are open to sort of more different, more feminist perspectives on gender questions. Is that
right?
I
Right. What
assume
they
there
see,
must be some religious movements that are more in that direction in Turkey, and are these students just not finding them, or?
yeah, and like no, it is like it is the case that like gender inequality grew in some ways in recent years, and also like no violence toward women, etc. Like no appears to be on the rise. So again, like no, they talked about those types of development as things related to the rise of a certain type of religiosity. So again, that's another thing too, right? Types of religiosity, types of religion. So again, one more thing that we can pay more attention to is this question of, again, like these are basic sociological questions, right? What exactly is a religious person? What does it mean to be religious? And again, different types of religiosity, how are they related to views on science, etc. And again, like many of the interviewees said, they wouldn't necessarily they would call themselves Muslim, but not necessarily religious. Because one thing that they said was, like, look at the religious people of today. I wouldn't want to be called religious if that is what religiosity means. So again, there's this like big debate perhaps about like what is the right way to be a religious person.
And the role of the state and politics in these issues. And yeah, because when you said, which gives more insight into gender and sexuality issues, science or religion, I wasn't sure why they picked the science. Is it because they felt like these were scientific topics as opposed to moral, spiritual topics? But from what you've said since, it's just more because they didn't trust the religious authorities that they were having access to and being exposed to. So it has like so many different elements and components there.
Yeah, and in fact, some of them, because they're college students, they are familiar with lots of ideas. So some of them also said, of course, science also has its kind of like, sexism, like in the history of biology, etc. They were familiar with those
They
things
were
too. You
familiar
can't
with them.
always, yeah, you can't always trust science in those issues either. But if you want to make a comparison, they would take the side of science. And of course, on issues like gender, of course, maybe they were saying that because I'm a sociologist. They were saying things like, oh, on gender, I would talk to a sociologist.
You are the trusted figure with the good
Exactly.
character now. Forget about the hard sciences or the religious
Right.
authority. It's now the social sciences day. That I haven't heard before. So
Yeah. Well, some people should trust us at least.
wow. Okay, so that's your current focus right now is more looking at contemporary issues.
Well, again, this is my like curse and blessing. I want to be both a historian and a sociologist. So on one hand, I'm doing the like late 19th century work still,
Okay.
the missionaries and like the Africa, like those types of stuff that I talked to you about, like is something that I'm doing. But I also want to do more contemporary work at the same time. We shall see which one is completed first. But yeah, that is what I want to do.
And you were saying how another discipline that you've touched on in addition to sociology and history is science studies, which obviously relates to both of those. But do you want to say anything more about either how, these sorts of research questions relate to what's going on in that area right now, or?
Yeah, I have actually not participated in that field much lately. But again, like, for me, part of science studies that was most influential is this question of, again, the issue of trust and the issue of like the boundaries of science. Again, not taking science for granted as you know, as a field or as a phenomenon, but again, thinking about how science is constructed, and also, you know, when like the whole idea of the, you know, like so-called like the co-production, co-construction of science and society at the same time. So that is again something that I would be interested in, because again, like the way science progresses, or the way science changes is also related to, you know, social change, and how these things, you know, feed into each other is something that I'm again interested in.
Yeah, I also got to do my PhD in an STS program
Mm.
here, and I just know other colleagues right now who are working on an edited volume about how religion is sometimes an area that's a little bit overlooked in science studies
Oh,
and
absolutely.
STS. So
Absolutely.
that's something like from each different angle, I understand, I agree with you. You sort of take something from each of these perspectives, and then it also reflects back on how each one could be a little bit more integrative. So again, I do have so many more questions, and I will just say that we did just have a small meeting called Beyond Belief, focusing on practice, where John
Mhm.
Evans gave a talk, and I could even send you the slides about how particular the American case was in terms of the interaction of Protestantism and science. And you probably know his views on this
Yeah,
better than
yeah.
I do even, but it was very interesting to hear that, and hopefully we'll be able to delve into that further. But I did also want to touch on, you know, you've throughout this conversation, you've said, you know, this is something that could use more research. This is something that could use more
Mhm.
research, what they think is really helpful for graduate students who are looking for topics for their thesis, for their dissertation. And I don't know if you have any other advice, either for people at that stage of graduate school or early career researchers who are thinking about investigating topics in this region of MENA, because on the one hand, you were saying this is a global conversation, but this particular case is a very interesting one. And the questions of the boundaries of science and religion, the negotiations are interesting here in different political and chronological periods. And I mean, I couldn't agree more with the contemporary relevance. I think that, you know, certainly in the Corona outbreak and ever since, people are definitely paying a lot of attention, it seems, to these categories. So any insights or advice you might want to offer, I think could be helpful.
Yeah, we talked about quite a few things already, but yeah, I would say again, like still, even if you're studying a certain society or a certain region, it's, I think, like helpful to do more comparative work. You know, yeah, maybe again, we've also, like from this region, we've always kind of looked at Europe or the US, but maybe more comparative work between this region and other parts of Asia or Latin America. Um, Again, for example, you know, something that that is not surprising to me, but still, or surprising to anyone perhaps, but that is still important. For example, when I was studying the Ottoman case, you know, an Ottoman intellectual writing in 1880, for example, about science, can sometimes almost verbatim say something that, say, like a Chinese scholar was saying at the same time. So, you know, like that kind of comparison could really be helpful. Not looking only at Europe and the US or North America in general as comparative cases. So that is something. And again, like, you know, comparisons within the MENA region. So yeah, I would also confess that mine has been focused really on the Turkish case. But of course, like, you know, between Turkey or the Ottoman Empire, different parts of the Ottoman Empire, like, you know, say Egypt, or again, you know, Syria, Lebanon, Turkey, like, you know, there was this kind of, like, you know, movement and travel, etc. So that is definitely something that we should be looking more at, rather than thinking of this region as this kind of, again, monolith. You know, like, we should talk about the diversity, and also like different types of Islam within the region, obviously. Maybe we already, like, we could say, like, we paid too much attention to Sunni Islam, maybe not as much on not only Shiism, but other types of, you know, like different interpretations of even Sunni Islam itself. So these different traditions are definitely worth studying more carefully. I guess that is something that, the US scholarship could be like helpful for us to like, because again, like the US case, because there's just so much awareness of it, has really paid more attention to different congregations, etc. So that kind of diversity should be something that we look at more carefully in our region. The other thing that I've mentioned already is, again, not, you also mentioned evolution, I mentioned evolution, but maybe like this is something that we already know, but evolution is not necessarily the only thing that matters in science and religion debates. Again, in this region too, like what are the things that matter to people? So one thing that I did, for example, in my own research about contemporary Turkey was like, for example, asking questions about, because this is unfortunately an earthquake zone, and we already had like horrible earthquakes recently. One thing that I thought could be worth asking was like, for example, could something like an earthquake be some kind of like a divine punishment? How do you think we could interpret events like this? So on that, like there's stuff to be found. Maybe that's not as common in the say European or the US cases. Whether it's just about say like geology, or if it's something else, or maybe again like climate change, can we see, or corona, can we see things like this as things with some kind of like divine meaning? So again, on that, I think it would be great if young scholars did work on like like what is the salient thing in the society that you're studying. What are the things that people do have strong views about? It doesn't always have to be evolution, or it doesn't always have to be the origin of the universe or things like that. Another thing, again, which is something that John Evans and many other scholars have been paying attention to, but again, like like you said, to like the question of morality. Um, when we talk about science and religion, or when we talk about religion with people, in many cases, what they're talking about, what they are primarily talking about, is values and morality. So thinking about science as a moral issue, in what ways is it linked to values and morality? Again, in our region, that wouldn't be difficult to study, because people do talk about these things a lot. And I would say like younger scholars could probably do lots of great work on that topic too. In what ways is science a moral issue in our societies today? And again, like, yeah, I would say, oh, another thing that I was going to say was, again, an insight from the sociology of religion and also sociology of culture in general is, again, something that is also studied in our field by other scholars as well. Like, do people even have consistent views on these things? Right? We just sometimes assume that people try to create, consistent and, coherent worldviews. And this is something that the sociologist of religion, Mark Chaves, wrote about. Like we think that religious systems kind of like almost operate like software, like operating systems in people's minds, and they always convert into action. This is, we know that this is simplistic, but in our scholarship we sometimes forget that this is too simplistic. So again, like perhaps paying more attention to contradictions, internal, inconsistencies in the ways in which people talk about science and religion. Like maybe, again, focusing more on the contextual and contingent ways in which people see science and religion and the relations between the two would be worth studying.
Wow, those are great suggestions. Actually, three other sort of ideas came to my mind also, because even originally when you were discussing about the personality of the man of science and what people were looking for in terms of morals and values in different periods and how those have changed, and you can plot what people would find as trustworthy or the appropriate morals or goals or aims of different things. So one question that came to my mind, which is coming up also for an object of study and also for academics who study these things themselves, is the question of activism. So the scientist as an activist, even in the political realm, either in terms of trying to convince publics of certain truths as opposed to doing more theoretical or practical or technological work. So there's all different kinds of activisms. And then the question of then the academics of those who study science or study science and religion, what sort of should there be an activist role at all to the academy? And, that also came to mind when you were speaking to these college students, if they're feeling frustration in these realms, it sounds like they probably are looking also for action, and how do all these things fit together? Another idea that came to my mind was the issue of different secularisms, just like the concepts of religion have changed. Also, the idea of the value and the meaning of science in people's lives, as even if it's not a totally consistent worldview, but different things along those lines. Let's see, and I think the third one has maybe escaped me right now, but there are interesting questions out there, huh?
Many. And yeah, like, no, I'm glad you raised that, because that is something that I asked the students. Like, I asked them, like, no, would you want scientists to talk about things that are not directly related to their field of research? It could be about religion, or it could be about other things. There was a lot of, kind of different opinions on that. Some of them said, no, they should just, like, focus on what they do, and that's all we want from them. Others said no, like, no, if they've done research on another thing, or if they know about, say, like, theology, if they've done their homework, they should talk about other things as well. Some of the things they said was also, like, if they're not careful, though, like, they might harm both science and the thing that they're talking about, especially, again, if it's about religion. They shouldn't alienate religious people, because some scientists do that, and I'm sure many of us would agree with that view. But again, like, activism, I don't know. Oh, and like, now this can turn into a big conversation about the state of academia today, which is a depressing topic. But like, I think it could be still like if we're gonna do, like, I mean, if scientists are gonna do some activism, maybe they could also, like, do something about the state of, again, yeah, like, the universities and the field of higher education today, etc. I would say.
Right. Perhaps research always has an activistic component. It's just whether we acknowledge it or not, or own it, or
Exactly. But again, like, I do wish, like, I mean, I would want there to be more, like, public involvement and engagement, like scientists, or maybe like academics these days, maybe some of them at least, I feel like have kind of more negative feelings about the public. Maybe too much anxiety about, again, the future of science, maybe the feeling that science is under threat or something like that. That has led some academics or scientists to think that, at least some sectors within the public are kind of, like, I don't know, unsalvageable, like they're lost. But no, I think I would want there to be more public engagement. Again, I'm not gonna say too much about the political side of that, like, no, the directly, like, more like ideological part of things. But again, like, no, to kind of, yeah, like, the boundaries of the university or the boundaries of science, I wouldn't say, like, they don't need to be, like, defended so kind of, I don't know, rigidly. I don't know. Like, I would want there to be more conversation.
yeah, I think that, science communication is coming up as a whole important element. I got to write a chapter also on museums and science museums, and the decisions of curators in doing outreach and recruiting religious publics, and what they're willing or interested or think is the right thing to do in terms of different compromises, or in communities that might rather certain exhibits not be shown, or whether they try to emphasize different things. So that's like a whole new field of interest for me that I'm really fascinated by, and dialogue in general in communities and in different countries and globally just seems like one of the topics on the rise, of people not being able to communicate across difference. So science and religion in that case is perhaps sort of a case study of then these broader questions about dialogue and negotiations in society. So
exactly. And like, I think scientists themselves should be more open to thinking about what they are doing, right? There's, again, like, I'm sure some scientists will say, no, like, no, we are under so much threat, that isn't something that we should prioritize now. But I would still say, like, thinking about what science is, what it does, what scientists are doing, I think it is essential, for the scientists too, to think about what exactly are the consequences of the things that I'm doing, why am I doing what I'm doing, etc. Like these types of conversation within the field of science are also essential, I would say.
Yeah, I would agree. That's definitely been the focus. But then again, I'm wondering about the symmetry, because we often speak about religious publics and scientists. And obviously the focus is going from, shifting from elites to regular humans. But is there also work being done with sort of religious leaders to be reflective on these issues? Or is that sort of more of a bygone age where people are more interested in scientists' views than religious leaders' views? I don't know. It just sort of popped out in your last comment that it
Yeah.
made me wonder.
Yeah, I think at least in the cases that I'm more familiar with, like I think, that is also something that we're gonna see more of. Like again, related to also the question of, secularism, etc. Now maybe it is something that is more kind of apparent to people that, and we know this already, like even the so-called religious elites can disagree with each other on lots of things. And and again, like more and more people are able to participate in those types of conversation. So yeah, like that is also something that we're going to see more of, I think. And again, like attitudes to science might also play a part in those types of evaluation of religious leaders in different publics as well.
Yeah, I mean, again, I could keep going, and I feel like on the one hand, we've touched on so many things of where the field has been, where it's going, all different components of it. I do see that we're coming to the end of our hour, so I don't know if there's anything else that you would like to bring people's attention to. I mean, as I said, I think we went kind of quickly on some of your research. So if there's anything else, either things going on out there that we should be aware of, or anything to pay attention to, or anything else you'd like to add. I like to open it up at the end and see what we missed. I know we might just have to have another conversation, because we
Exactly.
always
Yeah.
remember the things
Yeah.
after we get off the Zoom. But if anything jumps out at
Yeah, I kind of also kind of like forgot what I said like about like 40 minutes ago. But I could say maybe, yeah, like again, I would say still, it's really both, useful and also really interesting to like you said, to think about, like the diversity, the variety that might not be that easily, visible. Diversity among religious people, diversity among, scientists. I mean, these aren't also mutually exclusive categories anyway, but like, and different ways in which action and belief might be or might not be connected to each other. I would also say maybe like, I mean, there's already work on this, but like, things like say mysticism, spirituality, science, religion, rather than just talking about, yeah, like the main religions, let's also look at these main, and also like the new age religions, many different, like communities that have been emerging lately. There's just so much work to be done.
Right, on both sides, again, because on the one
Exactly.
hand, you have your participants saying, oh, science and religion is not what's interesting anymore. But then they do think that the most interesting questions about sexuality, about gender, science has so much to say about them. So maybe it's just, the different roles that science has now taken, and be it about vaccines or about any of these other subjects.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, we're learning to ask better questions when we talk to people, that's the best part of research, right? You learn to ask better questions. So let's do our research and find better questions to ask.
we're gonna have to rename, because it's not, science is not the right term anymore. We're gonna
Yeah,
have to
yeah, exactly.
so what, how do you rephrase that when people say, oh, it's not science anymore? That's you just
No, it's more like, well, tell me what it is.
right. And
Yeah,
these are, so then this is not a mixed methods. You're not doing questionnaires. You're doing strictly in-depth interviews on this.
exactly. Yeah, that's what I did.
Okay. And do you feel that there is place also for quantitative studies on this, or are you really just
Yeah, I'm too much of a qualitative person. Yeah,
okay.
I'm more interested in things like, what types of metaphor people use, what types of, like again, like the what I love is like, when people say one thing and like 5 minutes later they say the opposite thing, that is the beauty of those types of, research, I would say.
So even though you're a sociologist, you have certain research tendencies that almost go into ethnography and anthropology, whereas there are many more, at least in science religion, it seems like there's a lot of qualitative studies coming out of sociology,
Yeah,
quantitative studies coming out of
quantitative. Yeah,
sociology, and you're
yeah,
really taking the other focus. So
Yeah, well,
That's a
diversity
good.
and variety is
Yeah,
really
exactly. I happen to be on your side of my personal preferences, but I know that people would not, they love the numbers as well. So it's good that we
I
have
know,
colleagues that do the other work.
exactly.
So anyway, I can't thank you enough for giving us your time today. I really appreciate it. I know our paths have crossed a little bit at some conferences here or there, but very excited to follow what you're going to do in the future. I don't know if there's any particular publications you want us to know about, please send them to us, and we'd love to hear about what continues to go on in your work and in your teaching. Do you teach a science and religion course, or what are the sort of the course titles that you teach?
Oh, these days I'm just like teaching the required like no theory courses. I do teach a sociology of religion though, which is great, and religion and migration too. That is not my primary field, but it's like something that's really important. So that's what I've been teaching lately. Um, and yeah, hopefully something on science soon, but not yet.
Okay, great. Well, looking forward to staying in touch, and really thank you again.
Thank you so much, Rachel. It was great chatting with you. Bye.
Wonderful. Talk to you soon. Bye-bye.